Hi, I'm Diana.
And I'm Zach.
And we are The Farrier's Bellows, a podcast dedicated to bringing you games and tools to take your adventures further.
We're going to be talking about non-traditional indie RPGs. Some that have been around for years, others that are newer, to take you beyond the ordinary.
Today, join us as we delve the deep in Donjon.
Our first segment is The Call to Adventure. Donjon is a game designed by Clinton R. Nixon. It was first released in 2002, and it is a game of fantasy adventure. As far as our other games go, this might be the most in the vein of traditional fantasy adventure RPGs that we have yet played.
Oh, yeah.
It comes straight out of the Forge and was published by Clinton R. Nixon's Anvil Works. It is, according to the tagline, a game of old-school dungeoneering with an all-new bent. It is a dungeon crawl adventure game in the tradition of the classics. In the book, Clinton R. Nixon even talks about how it was born out of playing Dungeons and Dragons and wanting to interpret die results in a different way, or interpret checks in a different way. In it, fantasy adventurers are questing for glory and gold. There's gears, monsters, the standard 6 stats, and magic. It's fairly straightforward in theory, but takes a significant leap in terms of abstraction, especially when you consider its original source material. There's no clear setting for the game, no defined playable species, classes, abilities, or spells. Players come up with all of it at the table. And further than that, players can wrest narrative control from the GM, changing the arc of the story with successful rolls.
The game does have the same, well, not the same, but it has the 6 basic stats that are randomly generated through rolling 3 different D6s and taking the mean, which is already more complicated than a bunch of other ways of creating these statistics, right? The stats are virility, I can't say that.
Cerebrality.
That one. Discernment, adroitness, wherewithal, and sociality. These are just fancy ways of saying the same stats that we know and love now. But when you think about it, this game came out in 2002. So this is like a big deal. I don't know. I can't say some of these words, though, so I had a very hard time with this.
Yeah. We'll talk about this.
We'll go into it. I can't even say cerebrality.
Cerebrality.
So the number assigned to each of those stats is the pool of D20s that you are going to roll with. So the number is created by rolling 3 D6s and you're taking the mean, and then that number is the D20s that you're going to roll. Each roll pool is determined by your chosen attribute, one relevant ability, and any positions that you might have. For example, you want to see how good you are at talking to this bartender? You're going to roll sociality. You have the number 3 next to it, so you're going to roll 3 D20s. Plus, you have the ability Disarming Presence, which adds another 3 die to your pool. So, to talk to this bartender, you're rolling a total of 6 dice. A success is determined by how many die you have higher than the highest die rolled by your opponent or GM. To talk to the bartender, the GM's highest roll was a 14, while you rolled a 16, 17, and 19. So you win by 3. For each success on a roll, you have 2 choices. You can state a fact about your situation, or you can save your successful die and add it to your pool during another roll in the same scene, as long as that roll is related to why you rolled in the first place. When you fail on a roll, you get to narrate the fact that was stated by the winner. So you still have some control over what's happening to you, whether you win that roll or if you lose that roll. And that was a lot of fun to play with.
I think one of the most important things about that whole system, because it's sort of there's a lot of things going on in that system.
Yes, there are.
I think the important part about that is that if you succeed, depending on the degree of success, you are changing the narrative. Mm-hmm. And the greater degree of success, the more you can change the narrative. So what are some things that you liked about this game, Diana?
So I did really like the pool system. For a success, you can save your die. You don't have to change the narrative. You can save it to try and change the narrative a little bit later. And so you can save that die and you can add it to another roll in that same scene, which I thought was really helpful and was a really fun way of, especially in the beginning when you're not really sure how you're playing this game yet or what you're really doing. It was really good to be able to kind of save those successes and be like, I got the hang of this game. I'm glad I saved that. Now I super succeeded on this second thing. I really want to go forward with this.
One thing that is worth noting also about the pool system is that the game asks you to use D20s. It asks you to use D20s because of the way that you need as many variables as possible so that you can get more successes over your opponent, right?
Right.
The game does acknowledge that you can use any die size as long as you're using all the same die size, but obviously the smaller size you go, the more repeats you're going to have, the less variation on success you're going to have.
Right.
We considered using D10s because we had a lot more D10s on hand than we had D20s, but found just in a couple like quick test rolls, not very scientific or mathematically? Yeah, not very serious testing. We found that rolling similar pool sizes of D10s against one another, you were getting a lot more ties, a lot less successes over your opponent than when we did the D20s.
Right.
So D20s really are kind of mandatory, and a ton of D20s. You end up rolling
a lot.
Yes.
A lot of D20s. A lot.
I think it would be not unusual to say that you might roll like 20 D20s like between both sides of a test.
Yeah.
In a test.
Yeah.
So you're going to need a lot of dice.
Lots of D20s. But regardless of that, I did really like the pool system.
Yeah.
Was there anything that you liked?
One of the things that I really liked is the way items work in this game. You have 3 different categories of item, basically. You have weapons, armor, and other things that can help in different ways. Only one item in each category can be permanent at first level. As you level up, you start to you get more permanent slots for those 3 categories, which I think is a really cool way of mechanizing sort of what we think of when we think of these old school fantasy role-playing games where you get better by getting better, more interesting gear. When that is a core component of what makes a character better as they level up is getting more and more cool gear. I think that limiting your gear at early levels and slowly being able to build up in these 3 categories, it makes your gear more important. It makes it more of a part of your character's personality, which I thought was a really cool mechanic.
It feels very video gamey to me.
Yes.
Which I enjoy. It's a change because I don't play very many games where your armor is leveling you up, essentially. But that's all over the place in video games. Like, as you get more experience, you get more money, you can buy the bigger, better, shinier armor, and that makes you stronger, and then repeat, rinse. So yeah, it felt very video gamey to me in not a bad way. Definitely in a fun, unique, different way. Yeah, it also reminds me of children's television, which I think I reference a lot on the show, but it reminded me a lot of something like, say, Adventure Time, where a character might have all kinds of different items, right? But they only have so many items that are important to them. And depending on how the plot goes, they can have whatever, but Finn's golden sword is Finn's golden sword in Adventure Time. Right. That is an important part of his person. And then it becomes a big deal when he gets a new sword that is better. And if it's going to replace that item, it needs to be important to the character. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. Speaking of armor, I really liked how damage worked in this game. Yeah. You can choose, well, not you, the person who's getting hit, but the person who's doing the hits gets to choose if damage is going to go towards flesh wounds or if it's going to go towards affecting a stat that this player has. And I really liked that because it gave narrative control, but you already have narrative control. It just gives this other layer of narrative control and narrative play for this game that is unique. You don't see that very often where you get to choose what it is that you're harming when you're harming something. Like you can harm their knowledge. You don't have to harm their body. And in a lot of games, you have damage, you have XP, that's the end of that. But here, you can choose to mess with someone's brain or to mess with their body. And I think that's really cool. It's a really fun thing to play with.
Yeah, it for sure is. It adds another level to combat, it has you make the decision to, am I going to make it so that next round this person can't hit me as hard, or am I going to try to actively defeat them by like dropping their HP down?
Right.
And in order to permanently kill a character, you have to do both. You have to take down their virility to 0, I believe, as well as their flesh wounds down to 0. It is a game that can be deadly, but you have to be very intentional in order to kill characters.
Which is nice. I like that because I've played games where I've been like, dude, if you hit me, I'm going to die. I know you don't want me to die in this scene. You have to do something different. And here, like, no, you know you're killing me. Like, it's not an accident. This is on purpose. You are absolutely murdering me in this moment. And it's, I don't know, that intentionality is a nice little sprinkling of detail. I like it.
Yeah, for sure. Similar to the way that the game offsets the one permanent item in the 3 categories is that it abstracts what your wealth and your provisions. So your provisions are basically what in Dungeon World becomes your dungeon gear. Anything that you could use as a one-off or as a basic dungeon crawling adventure gear. You don't need to use one of your item slots for, say, rope or torches or rations or something. That all falls under your provisions. And anytime you need to know if you have something, you just make a provisions check, see if you have it, see if you have enough of it, see how that goes, which I think is it's kind of a standard thing now. I see in most of the games we play.
Right.
Most of the games we play don't try to say, oh, do you have a 10-foot pole? Do you have rope? Do you have this? Do you have that? It's just one check, one stat to encompass all of that minutia that most people in most games don't want to have to keep track of.
Right. I can think of lots of games where that isn't the case, and it is so annoying. It's so annoying where I'm like, oh, I used my rope already. I no longer have my rope. That's really dumb. That's really dumb. I want my rope. It's dumb. It's dumb. I like it. I prefer this. That's just a Diana thing. But I prefer just like this one general little line on my character sheet encompasses all of the things that I, as an adventurer, would have. I would have this. I've done this before. Why wouldn't I have rope? Just because I didn't write it down doesn't mean I don't have it.
Yeah.
So frustrating. That's it. That's just it's a teeny tiny little soapbox that I just got on, but it's a soapbox nonetheless. I
go both ways on it. It depends on the game to me. Sometimes I like that granularity.
Granularity sounds like a word.
And other times I don't want to be bothered with it.
Yeah. Especially when the story's good.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you liked?
I also really like the initiative system for combat. So the way the initiative system works is everyone involved in the combat rolls their discernment pool and nothing else, which is something that I have a bit of a question about. They roll their discernment attribute, and then the actual round of combat starts with a d20 set to 20, and then it counts down. And anytime that combat 20 hits one of your dice, you get to act. You get to do like a single action, right? So if you have a discernment of 4, you get to do 4 actions in a round of combat. And you get, because you have so many, the chances of you getting like early actions are higher.
Right.
I thought this was a really cool way to handle initiative and to handle rounds of combat.
Yeah.
I thought it was a very interesting way to look at characters who... Some characters can act more in combat and some characters can't act as much, so they need to make their actions count. I really liked it. I don't know how well I think it came across at our table.
I will say, as someone who had to do like 4 actions in a row, by my like third action, I was like, I'm just doing the same thing again, and I'm just doing the same thing again, and now I can't do anything for the rest of this game because my numbers just happened to be all right next to each other, and no one else got any numbers then in that range. So that was a little annoying, but that, I mean, how often does that probably happen? Not very often. I liked it too. I like how it kind of randomized your moves. And so it wasn't the person who hits the strongest always hits first. You had to sometimes think outside of the box. And I liked that. It was fun. It was a fun way to kind of solve the problem. It just gets a little annoying when you have 15, 14, 13, 12, and nobody else has any numbers there.
Yeah, and especially because your actions can take so long to resolve. A single action can result in a couple rounds of rolling dice, and then after you roll dice, deciding on how you're going to spend those successes, and then deciding how to determine those successes in the narrative, and then considering like all of the things together. A single round can feel like it takes a while.
Yeah.
So when one character gets like 3 rounds in a row and everyone else is just kind of watching that happen, it can start to drag a little bit.
Yeah, it definitely can. It definitely can.
But I felt like that was more of a problem with combat than it was a roll with that initiative system.
Yeah.
You know?
I agree. Speaking of successes, I really liked the law of successes in this game. I really liked that if you succeeded, you got to give facts and you kind of got to take over the story. I thought that was a really fun, I thought that was a really fun mechanic. But when I think about when this game came out and all of the games that it had to pull from, that's like groundbreaking. Being able to, I succeeded in this role. I get to tell you what happens here. I'm telling you what the monster's doing, and I'm telling you what I'm doing right now. And you don't get to stop me, GM. Like, has to be groundbreaking. Has to be, right? Has to be groundbreaking. And it's super fun to play with now. It had to have been super fun to play with when you didn't have that option and there were no other games to kind of, or there weren't a lot of popular games to kind of change up what you probably played with before.
Yeah, I think in terms of popularity,
right?
Like there were definitely games that were doing similar things to this, but this was a very early attempt to make this kind of mechanic popular.
Yeah.
It's something that I feel like we might take for granted now, this idea that, of course, the narrative is collaborative in some ways and mechanizing that collaborative nature. And it's definitely something that people still don't. I feel like every week on Twitter, I see D&D Twitter talking about how to be more collaborative with your players. And it's always like a very interesting conversation to me as someone who comes from story games and generally doesn't have that problem because these games have worked very hard to make that a mechanical, integral part of the game.
Right.
So I definitely see how this would be revolutionary, and is also now the law of successes has been refined.
Yes.
In modern story games in the decade and a half plus since this game came out.
17 years.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a long time. That's a high school student.
Yep.
I remember 2002. Anyway, what else did you like?
So along with the law of successes, one of the things that I thought was interesting about this game is that the game... Should we give an example of the law of successes?
When you succeed, you get to tell the story. In our game, we had a character who we were fighting a monster. She super succeeded and she made the monster friendly. So we were no longer fighting it. It was incredible.
Yes.
It was incredible.
There was a monster lurking in the shadows. They rolled discernment to try to identify the monster. And one of the facts that they said was it's friendly. That's the kind of way that you have control over this game. The standard kind of example in the book is you say, I want to find a door. You roll a check. And if you succeed, there's a door there.
Yeah.
And you get to state the facts about the door. The flip side of that is that the game explicitly states that the GM should be taking on a very antagonistic role. because you are sharing the narrative so strongly, you sort of, as a GM, have more freedom to take on what I would consider a sort of Gygaxian role of viewing it as me, the GM, versus the players. I'm trying to kill the players. I'm trying to screw over the players because the players have a lot more power in this type of game to combat that. The GM's role is to try to take those successes and take the law of successes and twist their wording around and find loopholes, find areas where you can misconstrue wording and try to turn it back around on the players. So, for example, when one of our players said that the monster they found was friendly, I interpreted that as, oh, this monster is too friendly and is going to try to keep you here. And it is not going to let you leave because it wants you to stay and play with it. And I gave it some like mind control abilities, some like hypnosis abilities to try to keep its friends where it wanted them. And I thought that was interesting.
Coming from a story games, collaborative storytelling background, like all of my gameplay has been like that. It was super fun to be explicitly told that the GM is your enemy, because I always play like you're my enemy, and I get in trouble because I always play like you're my enemy.
No matter how much I try to assure you that I'm trying to tell a fun story together,
I always act like you're trying to kill me at every turn. And in this game, I was proven right, and it was wonderful. It's just a nice change of pace because I don't play like that often. I mean, I play like that. I'm not supposed to play like that, but I play like that. It's just a nice change of pace for us. And I think this conversation is so interesting between you and I because this game came out in 2002. This is a classic historical game, right? And we have all this experience with these newer games, and we're coming back to it and we're like, oh, this is a breath of fresh air. But like, this is a 17-year-old game, and we have been playing much, much newer games.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about that in a second because it is a 17-year-old game. Anyway, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about? Anything else that you wanted to say?
I like the main abilities and supporting abilities system. So when you are making your character, you decide on a race or a class, and that only comes into play really in terms of your abilities, which are they're skills that determine how you can add more dice to your pool. Basically, they're additional dice to add to your attributes. So you have a main ability, which is like the very general specific thing that your race or class is good at doing. So for example, the class mercenary might have the main ability hit people with weapons. That is what that class is good at doing generally. That's what defines that class. The sorcerer's main ability might be cast spells. After that, you have more specific supporting abilities that only come into play in very specific situations. So the mercenary might have knock down doors or intimidate, and the sorcerer might have avoid magic or communicate with demons. I think these are very cool ways to abstract out a character. They're very cool ways to think about what you are interested in when you are making your character. Like, these are the things that I want my character to do. These are the things that I want my character to be good at. And you can communicate that with the GM and with the rest of your party to make an interesting character and to make an interesting party. And to make really anything that you want. You are not limited by what the game says a ranger is. You can make up your own definition for what a ranger is in this world. And I thought that was a cool, interesting aspect of the game.
Yeah, I agree. It's super hard to come up with stuff sometimes, which is, it's helpful that the book gives you some examples because it is really hard to come up with stuff. But I do like the openness of it because I know for my character, it gave, like, I used magic. I had the ability to use magic when I didn't even conceptualize my character as being a magic user, but it was a supporting ability that made a lot of sense for my character as we were building that character out. And that's nice because if I had just been given a character sheet where I had to check off moves, I wouldn't have been given a magic ability. That wouldn't have been something I could have done. So it's cool. It's just hard to come up with them sometimes.
Yeah, and your magic was what, like cast survival magic or something like that? Mm-hmm. Which gave you the ability to cast magic specifically in
survival
terms of,
modes.
what could help you survive.
Right.
Because you were like
I was a novice ranger.
Yeah.
I was like a ranger in training.
Yeah. Which I thought was very cool. We had like a ranger in training, we had a bodyguard, and we had a bartender.
Mm-hmm. We were very good.
Yeah, it was a very interesting party that I thought was cool. I like that method for character creation and fleshing out a class. I thought that was cool.
Yeah. Is there anything you had any questions about?
Yes, a lot. I had a lot of questions about a lot of things. I wonder sincerely why all the stats were given the names that the stats were given. It feels like parody in a way that makes me wonder if this whole game is parody. Virility for strength, cerebrality for wisdom, I don't even remember now, like how they
cerebrality is out. Intelligence.
Yes, and then discernment was wisdom.
Yeah.
Adroitness, which the entire time we were playing, referred to adroitness.
Yeah, we made it French.
Well, because Donjon is French. Wherewithal and sociality, they are so, not only do they feel needlessly different, they are needlessly mouthy.
Yes.
Like they are a mouthful, and there's no reason for these to be tier 3 vocabulary when they could be tier 1 vocabulary.
All right, hold on. You can't use work knowledge on the internet without explaining tier 1 and tier 3. These are some SAT words, and they don't need to be. They don't need to be SAT words. Adroitness can be dexterity. You don't need to make it super fancy in French. Adroitness. It doesn't need to be like that. Doesn't need to be like that.
Basically, the vocabulary is so complex that it feels like a joke to me.
Yeah.
And it makes me question whether I should be taking the rest of the game
seriously
as a serious game or not. When I don't think much of it, it's definitely, I don't know, the rules of the game talk about, you can play this game with different tones, either like funny or serious. It seems like it is a sincere game in all other respects, but I just can't take those. It really messed with my head.
Yeah, because
we never referred to, except for adroitness.
Yeah.
We referred to all of them by the standard 6 stats that you see in almost every other fantasy adventure game.
So the question that I have then is, I've never played D&D. I'm very open about the fact that I've never played D&D. Does D&D use wisdom, intelligence, dexterity?
Yes.
Are those the words that they use?
Yeah.
So then was this an attempt to differentiate it from D&D, and then everybody hated it, so everybody went back to the D&D words? I can't say some of them. I think it's a problem.
Yes. I do wonder if I wonder if this is a holdover from story games trying to set themselves apart, and then other story games that still, story games realizing, well, if you're just going to do the same 6 stats, just make it the same 6 stats. And if you're not going to do the same six stats, don't do the same 6 stats.
Right.
If you're going to do something different, do something different. If you're going to make it the same, just make it the same. It's okay either way. Just
adroitness. Adroitness. Something that I had a question about, which is related to kind of adroitness, is there are no cheat sheets for what you're rolling, when you're rolling, and how much you're rolling of that thing that you're rolling. And I don't know if that's a newer RPG thing or not. I know D&D has, players have their own books and their own tables that they can look at. We spent a lot of time looking up what we were rolling, and it would have been helpful if the players had our own cheat sheets or our own reference pages or something. That would have been really helpful. So I'm not sure why that wasn't just incorporated into the character sheet, or just given, you get a character sheet and a basic move sheet, which is a thing that happens now in games. So I just don't know why that wasn't there. Because D&D, players had their own books. So it's this concept of giving the players cheat sheets was a thing.
This game does not have a lot of support for players. It does not have a lot of support for GMs.
Yeah.
The rules that the GM needs to reference throughout the game are spread all throughout the book. There is no one clear location for everything. I found it difficult to run because there was no centralized resource for all the information that you need to parse. One question I had was, how can I get my players to be more risky and call for rolls on their own? This game requires the players to try to break the narrative. It really requires the players and the GM to try to wrestle over narrative control. And I found that we kept falling into this part, the players would expect me to tell them what was happening or what they saw around them, and they were not attempting to take narrative control unless I told them to make a roll. When the game explicitly says players can call for rolls, players can say, I want a roll to see if a purple-headed dragon shows up. You can do that. Right. You have complete control over like saying what you want to try to make happen. And our players did not do that very often.
So I think that's a problem with the players. Speaking as a player who was at that table, that is a problem with the players. And I know for me, I'm not going to speak for everybody else that was at the table, but I know for me, that level of control is not something that I am used to. No. I'm not used to being able to describe this setting before I've done a thing. And like when I do a thing, I usually get some sort of control. I can say something about what's going on. And that I don't think we had any problems with. Once we rolled, stating facts, using that law of successes, I don't think that was an issue for us. But describing the scene is not something that we are used to. But also, very specifically, the group of people that we play with are just too nice to each other. That is a problem we've had with several of these games. We're just too nice to each other. And so, like, you're the GM. You get to tell us where we are. Obviously, that's your job. And then our job is to play with it.
It is unlike a lot of games that we've played, even games that are very collaborative in nature in terms of world building.
Right.
Because it's not collaborative. It is trying to wrestle for control.
Right.
It's not you're working together to build the scene and to build the world. You are fighting to build the scene. So...
and we're too nice for that.
Yeah, we had some difficulty with that.
Yeah. When you succeed on most rolls, you get to say some facts. You get to kind of change the narrative a little bit. You don't get to state facts with wealth rolls, and I don't understand why.
What fact would you state?
I don't know. I have a ton of money. Let me make up my mind. I got all the money. Let me figure it out. I don't know what I would say, but I just don't know why that's not a possibility.
There are some rolls that do not include the law of successes just because it wouldn't add anything to the narrative. When you roll a wealth check, you're saying, can I afford this thing?
Yeah, but like... You could be like, I not only did I afford it, but I paid with it with rubies, and so everybody's really impressed and I get a free thing next to it. Like, I think you could use the law of successes to add something to the narrative when you're paying for groceries. I do think that you could do that. Or you could be like, okay, I paid for it, but I fell on my ass on the way out, and now everybody's staring at me, and so we were trying to be incognito, and now we're not. And I just did that to us. Congratulations, group. Like, I still feel like even though you're paying for groceries,
there's
there's still room for telling the story. And I just don't understand why we're not allowed to.
I don't think Clinton R. Nixon is going to slap the game out of your hands.
We're not allowed to. It's against the rules.
You know, I'm a stickler for the rules.
You are.
I like rules as written. And if you can't play the game rules as written, I have feelings about the game then. That's just kind of how
Meanwhile, I'm just like, these were all made up. So we get to make them up as we go.
Yeah.
Anyway, is there anything that stood out to you?
Yes, a lot of things stood out to me. So this game is available on PDF. At only 80 pages, this game feels very dense. There is a lot packed into these 80 pages, and it can be difficult to... I found it a little bit difficult to get through. I found it a little bit difficult to wrap my head around at points. And I found it difficult to use at the table. It was not verbose in the way that we talked about Troll Babe being verbose. It just feels like the formatting is very dense, and it is something that you should be prepared for as you go through this 80-page rulebook. I've read 80-page rulebooks that felt like very clear and a breeze, and this was one that was like, I definitely needed to pay attention as I was reading and think about what it was saying as I read every single page.
I feel like it's one of those books that because all the information that the DM needs, all the charts, all the tables are on different pages, you kind of had to really know the book. Mm-hmm. You had to know where you were looking. Otherwise, it was going to take you a while to find everything that you needed. So not only is it dense, but it's something that you had to like be really, really comfortable with. And that's hard to do with a dense 80-page book game.
Other things that stood out to me are throughout the game, there are these notes called dials. These are notes throughout the book that give tips on how to tweak the game for your group or to make changes based on your needs. It talks about dials about setting the tone. It hits on dials about changing minor rules in order to fit what you need, such as the mass amount of D20s that you can change to D10s if you need to. I thought that was handy, although many of them I questioned the usefulness of, but I also feel like it might have felt more necessary at this point in game design history to clearly state you can use this game however you want and you can make these changes to make it work.
Right.
And lastly, it made me laugh that in the sample adventure, under Weapons and Armor 3, Markup 3, the local blacksmith and tanner, 2 NPCs in the sample adventure, are a married couple and have good, well-priced goods. In parentheses, when I ran this adventure, I had the blacksmith and tanner both be male. The characters were surprised that such a small little farming village was progressive in allowing same-sex marriage. End parenthetical. I thought this was really funny. It felt very 2002 to me to blatantly be like, you can be progressive with this game.
Yeah.
When I feel like most games now, it's just baked into the game. It's baked into the setting.
It's in the examples and then it moves on and it's never pointed out ever.
Yes.
But he pointed it out in this game, which makes sense. In 2002, we're 17 years later and thankfully we're a little bit further along.
At least in like the story games scene. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. I didn't say a lot of it. I did say a little bit. Let's approach the Inmost Cave. So this game touches on shared narrative control, which we've kind of been talking about as we've been going through this game, or rather as we've been talking about this game and the things that we liked and the things that were on there. And we've already mentioned it several times, but shared narrative control is something that is more prevalent in newer games. And in games in specific genres, right? Mm-hmm.
So this game is a clear dungeon crawl game. And in dungeon crawls, this idea of sharing narrative is kind of a contentious one. The idea that a dungeon master is out to slay their players is pretty, I said this before, but it's kind of like Gygaxian, right? In the old school dungeon crawls, it is players trying to test their intelligence as players to defeat a system that has been set up by the other player. It's this player versus player mentality, testing the adventurer's intelligence versus a trap-laden ecosystem of dungeons. It kind of has like a board game-esque in its setup. This idea that players might have a shared role in the story is one that can spark some debate, especially in dungeon crawl style games. Mm-hmm. And when it's done, it's often done outside of the dungeon crawl genre. Collaborative narratives are built into a lot of different genres that fit that idea more, based around telling a story versus trying to test your intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. I just keep thinking of like general adventures, like from point A to point B stories that we've kind of been playing lately, where you do get to sort of share the narrative a little bit more. And then obviously romance games, you obviously are sharing the narrative there. And I don't know that I can think of another dungeon crawl where you are sharing the narrative like you do in this game.
Donjon presents a clear attempt to emphasize in some ways the deadly DM versus innovative adventurers setup of old school dungeon crawlers, while still giving players more opportunities to control what happens in the story, as well as give them a stronger arsenal to show off how innovative and witty they can be. So in a traditional dungeon crawl or like a traditional OSR, old school role-playing game, players are limited in terms of things like their abilities and their gear in order to try to show off how they can laterally solve problems.
Right.
In this, we see players given a different tool to try to navigate the GM versus players like binary, which is they have the law of successes. They can take their successes and change the world around them. So it's not just the characters, their abilities, and their gear that is being tested. It is the player's ability to manipulate the setting to come up with different solutions and try to implement those new solutions in the narrative. So Donjon gives players the opportunity to change the narrative in their favor by calling for roles that might determine their surroundings. A player can say there's a door here and define whether or not there is. From there, the GM is expected to take on the role of an evil genie and try to interpret these facts in creatively dangerous ways, such as we talked about before, the monster is friendly. It's so friendly that it wants to keep you here forever. I found that the concepts around this are very cool, but admittedly pretty difficult to do in practice. It requires a lot of lateral problem solving thinking. It requires a lot of playing on words and finding loopholes and twisting people's words. It's a lot of thinking about the setting. It's a lot of thinking about the systems of the setting and thinking about how they can be manipulated. There's not much in the game at all that will support you in how you can change your surroundings or twist your opponent's words. I think immediately of Powered by the Apocalypse games, which on a miss give you a very clear option for how you can and cannot change the narrative. A move in PBTA will say, on a hit, you have these 3 questions to ask.
Right.
On a miss, the GM will do this to change the setting.
Right.
In limiting your options that way, it feels much clearer. It feels much more manageable. And it is still giving both players and GM a way to change the world.
This is too big. When things are too big, it's hard to figure out what you're doing and how you're doing it. So in child development, it's very important that you give kids boundaries, but that those boundaries aren't too tight. You want kids to explore and to play, but they need to know where their safe boundaries are. All humans are like that all the time. We like to know where our safe boundaries are so that we can play with them. When you just say, change whatever you want, however you want, whenever you want it, it's too big. It's too big to play with, and it's too big to feel comfortable with. But when you say these 3 things are how you can change it, or these 2 ways are the ways that it can be manipulated, you can still play with that. You can still maneuver and change the world, but you've got those boundaries that make it feel a little safer and make it feel a little bit more comfortable. Yeah.
The amount of options in this game made it feel impossible to run for me.
Right.
I had a lot of difficulty running this game because I didn't know what to prep for or how to prep it, because anything that I prepped could be changed so drastically that it wouldn't matter.
Right. That's a lot of brain power.
It is, right? It's a lot of brain power. It's a lot of processing power at the table. I will say that as an attempt to share narrative control, I think this is a at least more interesting method than what DMs have been forced to do in D&D, which is things like fudging dice rolls, ignoring rules, rolling your dice behind a GM screen so that you can so that after you roll, you can decide what, quote unquote, what the dice said to make the most interesting story. What this does do, which I like, and as I said, I'm a big rules person, this gives everyone enough control that you don't have to break the rules to make sure that everyone feels empowered.
Right.
You are playing by the rules when you're breaking the game or breaking the narrative. It's just I found it very difficult to do that.
This is a personal opinion. It's too big. You need some boundaries.
Yes.
People like boundaries and we need them. They're important.
With that said, I wonder what would happen if we cut down on some things and clarified the shared narrative. Discerning the pool for an uncontested action requires you to find the right table, decide on a level of difficulty, figure out which level of the donjon they are on, add the donjon level modifier, roll the pool, and then use the law of successes to changed the narrative. NPCs require you to make an entire character. For every single monster that a player might encounter, I need to come up with 6 attributes, I think 5 abilities, its saving throws, its flesh wounds, and any special skills that a monster might have.
That's a lot.
All for a monster that might not appear in the game because of how the players change the narrative, or who might decide that suddenly it's their friend. It's so much.
Yeah.
It's so much.
It is absolutely a lot.
And so if there are, I think what we have found is that as game development has developed, we've found ways to trim the superfluous aspects of the game just down to what we actually really need. It kept the parts of Dungeons and Dragons that it thought it needed. Mm-hmm. And over the course of the last decade and a half, we figured out more clearly what can be cut.
Right.
If the rulebook was cleaned up and reorganized, or if there was at least a resources sheet, like I could have used a GM screen for this. In the end, this game ends up feeling more complicated than if I were to just pick up Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. And because of that complicatedness, this is not a new player-friendly or new GM-friendly game. Like, at all. You definitely need experienced players and experienced GMs playing this game. You don't need years and years and years of gameplay experience, and you don't need to be the best player out there in the world, but you need to have an understanding of how role-playing games work, and you need to be comfortable with your own ability as a role player and as a GM to play this game and to run this game. This is not a, hey, I just discovered role-playing games, let me play this game. No.
In doing research on this game, I found forum posts about people like saying, this was my first RPG ever. And my response was, how? How did you stick with this hobby? This is a great game. It was fun in a lot of ways. If somebody had told me this was what role-playing games were, I do not think I would have tried again.
Yeah, this is insane. Now, I will say, if your only gameplay experience is D&D, if that's the only type of role-playing game you've ever played, then this might be a good lead-in to like other storytelling games or to newer storytelling games. This is very similar to D&D, so it might be right in your wheelhouse. But we had a player at the table who was like, this feels exactly like D&D. She wasn't happy about it because she was trying to play something different. But like, if that's your experience, then this might be a really great gateway like game for you. But as somebody who was doing this in reverse, this was not a new player friendly game. This was not a new GM friendly game.
And I am also open to if there was user error in this.
Oh yeah,
I would be open to hearing about that.
Absolutely.
There is a lot in this game that I think would be great. And I think the more you play this game, the more streamlined some of that stuff is going to be.
Right.
You're going to know exactly just how to, come up with, estimate what the Donjon level is, what the difficulty test is, about what the attributes of an NPC are going to be. I think the more you play this game, the more you're going to be able to make stuff up on the fly, and it's going to flow a lot better.
Absolutely. But you have to like it the first time you play it to play it again.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that I didn't like this game, but there's a lot to this game. And if you've never played role-playing games before, this is not the game to jump in both feet with.
Our last segment is Return with the Elixir. Dinah, what is some media, books, movies, games, or music that would inspire or also explore the ideas that we found in Donjon?
I had such a hard time finding like specific examples of this, but I found one that I thought might work. Reality TV shows where you get to vote on the winner.
The connections you make in this section, we are always like, we go back and forth, and then by the time I'm like, kind of like, all right, fine. Let me hear it. Let me hear your justification for this.
Listen, you get say, right? You get a say, but you know that the game is rigged against you. You know that like that stupid singer who is terrible and no one likes is going to keep going on because no one likes her, and the game is set up against you, but you still get a vote on who the other people are, and you might actually get a vote on who that person is. Mm-hmm. Like you get a say, you get to change what the contest is when you call in and you vote on American Idol or whatever. So I'm sticking by that one. Reality TV shows where you the audience get to vote on the winner.
I'm going to say Inspectors by Jared Sorensen. Inspectors is one of the first games we did for Ferris Bellows. It might be the first game we did entirely. It's a game of corporate culture and monster hunters. And I chose Inspectors because one of the things I really like about Inspectors is that it gives players a lot of narrative control in terms of the GM says this is the problem that's happening, and then the players come up with the solution to the mystery over the course of the game. It works really well. The pacing sings. I think this is a game that does shared narrative in a really powerful and strong way.
My next one is fan fiction. As a media. It's like the whole thing. Because you can't change books that are written. You don't get any say on that. And you can try to interpret them a little bit differently, but they were written. The story is told. However, you can write your own story based on that book. Harry and Ron can be OTP. They can do that if you want. That can happen. It's Harry and Draco. We all know that's actually OTP, but that's not the point. Fan fiction. That's it. Fan fiction. All of it.
I also included a board game, a card game called Super Fight. Super Fight is a really goofy little party game that is a little similar to Cards Against Humanity, but I like better than Cards Against Humanity.
You're creating superheroes.
Yes, you get a subject and a power, and the power, quote unquote, could be good or it could be bad. Then you have to, so it could be a raptor that's 50 feet tall but is allergic to cats. And then your opponent gets Sherlock Holmes, but he's radioactive with a beard of bees. And then you just have to argue over who would win in that fight.
I love this game.
My connection to Donjon is that it is, it's just this very goofy narrative board game where you are arguing over the narrative and trying to twist each other's words and the aspects of their characters against them. It's just a fun arguing game, which is why you love it so much.
I do. I get so loud. Everyone gets so intimidated. My last thing is modding video games, which is the exact same thing as fan fiction, but with video games. And again, it's not a book or a movie, but I think it is still the same concept, right? Like you've taken this story and you are changing it to a way that you would want. And then another video gamer is going to mod it differently. And you guys can I don't mod video games. I don't know how this works.
What do you know about modding video games?
I know that you can make things hamburgers and you can play as a hamburger instead of a dinosaur.
I'm sorry, what?
People do that, no? Is that not modding?
What game are you thinking of?
I don't know, my love. Where if there's a monster and then you make it a hamburger or a cat or something. Isn't that modding? It doesn't matter. I still think it fits. I'm not wrong.
You're not wrong.
I might not be right, but I'm not wrong.
My last one is what I think is my favorite OSR game. So OSR is old school Renaissance or old school role-playing. It is a movement of games that are centered around trying to recreate the dungeon crawl games of the late 70s, early 80s, like the early onset of role-playing games, early basic edition Dungeons & Dragons. These are modern games that are trying to do that. And in a lot of ways, I feel like Donjon falls into the OSR in a way that I think is very interesting, but that we didn't get around to talking about because we got lost on so many tangents. Donjon is really, I feel like, an OSR game. It is an old school dungeon crawl game with modern sensibilities. And so I think you could view any OSR game as a similar kind of contemporary to Donjon. My favorite that I've played is Macchiato Monsters, which is a blast. It's called Macchiato Monsters because it's a blend of two other OSR games, the White Hack and the Black Hack. But one of the things that I love most about Macchiato Monsters is the delta value. All dice have all usables, any consumable items have a delta value. and that is like it's a die size, and whenever you use it, you roll that delta, and if you get a 1, 2, or 3, it goes down. So you slowly are using stuff up, and the smaller the delta, the more quickly it's going to get used up. The higher the delta, the longer you have it, which I love as a method for tracking your gear and tracking the stuff that you have, tracking how much provisions you have. I think it works really well. It also does traits in much the same way as Donjon uses abilities. Macchiato Monsters has traits, martial specialties, and magic spells. They work much the same way in that it's based around innovative thinking by the player to come up with different ways to use these ideas, and it works really well.
So what's a story you'd like to tell with this game?
I want to know what would happen if I tried to play a pre-written D&D adventure in Donjon. If it would just fall apart immediately, or if it would work well for the most part.
I feel like it would fall apart immediately, but it would be fun to play and discover.
Yeah, I want to see. That's what I want to do.
Yeah.
How about you?
Tron World.
Please expound.
You get sucked into a computer. Tron World. Digital. Weird motorcycles. Dungeon crawl, but in Tron World.
You know,
someone else at our table wrote that down, and I was like, that's so smart. Tron World.
I can't argue with that.
Tron World.
Tron World.
Green and black. I think that's the Matrix, actually. I don't think it doesn't matter. Computers. In a computer. Dungeon crawl. That'd be fun.
The Fair's Bellows is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find us on Twitter at GauntletRPG. You can find us on our website at gauntlet-rpg.com, and we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet, where you can contribute to The Gauntlet and support more great shows like ours. Also, be sure to check out the forums at forums.gauntlet-rpg.com, where we post a thread for every episode and would love to hear from you.
Thanks to our editor, Zach B. Also, you can find us on iTunes. Please rate and subscribe to us there. We would really appreciate it.
Please follow us on Twitter at Farrier's Bellows. Talk to us and talk about us. We would love to hear your thoughts on the show and on the game. You can find me on Twitter at ZWGarth.
And me at ICDiana.
You can also find the actual play show that Diana and I do together at HeartPointsPod on Twitter.
Until next time, you cannot dream yourself into a character. You must hammer and forge yourself one.
Remember to stock up on D20s.